Okay, brethren, the Bible's quite a big book, as you're probably well aware, and it's got a lot of very interesting stories in it. When I was at school, we had a little Bible story book, just Bible stories. So it was like Noah's flood, Tower of Babel, Samson fighting with the lions, and so on, King David slaying Goliath, lots of interesting stories, Jesus walking on water. But apart from the stories, which are interesting, it also contains many biographies, the life stories of men of God, and also some of the losers as well. And there's much that you and I can learn from the stories, and particularly from the biographies of people in the scriptures. You know, all of God's men, all the men of God, all the women of God had flaws, a bit like you and me, one imagines, right? But they all share common characteristics as well that made them successful, that made them men of God. They all made mistakes. That's, I think, standard. Noah got drunk. Moses murdered a man. Samson chased loose women. David committed adultery. You could keep on going. So they had flaws. Of course they did. Abraham lied about his sister, and so on. You've got flaws. I've got flaws, right? But they were always, it seems, one key characteristic, they were always loyal to God, faithful to God. A bit like in marriage vows. When people got married, at least in olden days, up till 5 minutes ago, they made vows to each other, right? For better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health. So you're going to commit to that other person irrespective of the circumstances. Sometimes life is good. The wind's behind you, propelling you along. Sometimes you're facing into the wind. Sometimes it's a hurricane. But a good marriage survives and lasts and endures all hardships. And that's our walk with God. We're committed to walk with God irrespective of the circumstances, irrespective of the hardships. We'll all face trials and tribulations. That just goes with the territory of being a human being, right? Our task is to remain loyal and faithful irrespective. So today I want to look at the life of Joseph because he's a good example. I mean, he's an excellent example of somebody who was loyal and faithful and could not be moved from the path that he was on, even in the most trying of circumstances, and his circumstances were particularly trying, right? Now, they say that experience is a good teacher, and it probably is, but it's a hard teacher. Ideally, you and I would be better off if we learned from other people's mistakes, other people's lessons. And in Scripture, there's plenty of biographies and life stories for us to learn from. If you take the case of Joseph, just immediate background, he was one of 12 brothers, right? Jacob, his father, he had 12 brothers. And between the brothers, there were 4 mothers. Bit confusing. Don't see too much of that nowadays. But you had Leah and Rachel and Bilhah and Zilpah. So four mothers with a total of 12 sons. That must have been a tense household. 4 women in the same house, 4 wives in the same house. That sounds to me like a dangerous territory, and no doubt it caused problems, I would have thought. So there's, young Joseph growing up in a house where, in some ways, the example of his father would not, I think, be a particularly good example. Thinking of Jacob for a moment. Jacob was a cheat and a deceiver. Right? He deceived his father. He deceived his twin brother, right? Run off with the birthright blessings and so on. So he was a bit of a deceiver. And he was father to these 12 boys with 4 mothers in the background. Difficult household. Not surprised it was a little bit dysfunctional, as they say today. But let's pick up the story, if we can, in Genesis chapter 37. Let's read verses 1 to 4. Genesis 37, verses 1 to 4. Now Jacob, the father, dwelt in the land where his father was a stranger, in the land of Canaan. This is the history of Jacob. Joseph, pick up the story of Joseph now, being 17 years old, just a teenager, was feeding the flock with his brothers. And the lad was with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, or 2 of his wives. And Joseph brought a bad report of them to his father. Bit of a tittle-tattle was young Joseph. Of course, his brothers were a pretty bad lot, so I'm sure there was lots of bad things to say about them, and Joseph didn't hold back. Now Israel loved Joseph more than all his children, because he was the son of his old age, also the son of Rachel, his favoured wife. Also, he made him a tunic of many colours. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to them. So you can see the problem. I mean, speak peaceably to him. So you can see the difficulties. The father Jacob is lavishing attention and favoritism on Joseph to the exclusion of the others, and they don't like that. Why should they? They can be jealous. It says there they hate their brother Joseph. I mean, any parent who's got several children has to be careful about showing favoritism. You don't really want to do that if you're a parent. You have to treat your kids, fairly, and so on. Not lavish favours and better presents on one, not the others, because that causes problems. It caused problems here. They don't like Joseph. He tells tales. That's not good. And he's got this rainbow-coloured tunic, setting him apart. They don't like that either. And his dad favours him. They don't like that either. All right? And you might think, well, maybe Joseph can recognise that and be careful what he does. Not a chance. Verses 5 to 11. Now Joseph had a dream, and he told it to his brothers, and they hated him even more. So he said to them, "Please hear this dream which I have dreamed. There we were, binding sheaves in the field. Then behold, my sheaf arose and also stood upright. And indeed your sheaves stood all around and bowed down to my sheaf." And his brother said to him, "What? Shall you indeed reign over us? Shall you indeed have dominion over us?" So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. Not very tactful, is he? I mean, favoured son, perhaps he's a little bit pompous, gets all the goodies, right? He's dad's favourite, so he's not very self-aware. Talks about this dream in which they all apparently are bound down to him. Of course they hate him. They already hated him. They hate him more now. You might have thought, well, surely after that he'll realise, oh my word, I think I'm speaking out of turn here. I think my big fat mouth is going to get me into trouble. I better be careful in future and try and measure my words more carefully, try and learn some tact. Nope, not going to happen. Verses 9 through 11. Then he dreamed still another dream and told it to his brothers and said, "Look, I have dreamed another dream. And this time the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars bowed down to me." So he told it to his father and his brothers. And his father Jacob rebuked him and said to him, "What is this dream you've dreamed? Shall your mother and I and your brothers indeed come to bow down to the earth before you?" And his brothers envied him, but his father kept the matter in mind. Right? So clearly Joseph lacked any sense, lacked tact, just a big mouth and opened it. And his father even rebuked him, although he recognised what was happening there. Now, it does seem afterwards, looking back, these dreams were actually from God. They weren't just the sort of dreams you and I have if you have too much pizza at night. These were God-given dreams. And I think, no doubt, in tough times in the future, which were ahead of him, probably Joseph could look back and these dreams would encourage him. He'd think, well, no, are these dreams? And they're not just ordinary dreams. These are very, very real dreams. I'm sure these dreams came from God, and they suggest somewhere along the line, at some point in my life, I'm going to have high status, and my brothers will even come and bow down to me, and even my father. Right? So I think at times he could look back at this, and this helped him through the difficult days. But he certainly lacked tact, and we can see the problems that caused. And all of us, you and me, should be tactful people. Our words can wound people. They can encourage people, and we should be careful with our words, not to wound and not to cause problems unnecessarily. If you hold your place there, but turn to Proverbs 13 and verse 3, Psalms and then Proverbs, and chapter 13 of Proverbs, which are full, of course, is full of Proverbs, little pockets of wisdom, little nuggets of wisdom. Proverbs 13 and verse 3, "He who guards his mouth preserves his life, but he who opens wide his lips shall have destruction. That's one of many, many proverbs about our tongues, about watching our words. It says, if you guard your mouth, don't just wag it willy-nilly, unthinkingly. You engage your brain first, then start your mouth going. Don't be a motor mouth. He who guards his mouth preserves his life. He who opens wide his lips shall have destruction. And Joseph, unfortunately, at this stage as a 17-year-old teenager, he opened his mouth pretty much right and got himself into a heap of trouble. Ecclesiastes says there's a time to keep silence and a time to speak. But silence comes first, not the speaking. Silence comes first. Somebody said diplomacy is thinking twice before saying nothing. Be careful with our words. They can get us into serious trouble, right? And in a sense, Jacob's words, sharing these dreams, it did cause, I'm sure, additional tension to what was already there. Back to Genesis 37. Let's read verses 12 through 36. Picking up in verse 12. Then his brothers went to feed their father's flock in Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, are not your brothers feeding the flock in Shechem? Come, I will send you to them. So he said to him, here I am. Because back in these days, you didn't have mobile phones, so the lads might be off with the sheep, goats, perhaps, 2, 3, 4, 5 days travelling away, and you can't hear from them day by day. So Jacob says, you better go off and just check out everything's okay. Verse 14, then he said to him, please go and see if it is well with your brothers and well with the flocks, and bring back word to me. So he sent him out of the valley of Hebron, and he went to Shechem. Now a certain man found him, and there he was, wandering in the field. And the man asked him, saying, what are you seeking? He said, I'm seeking my brothers. Please tell me where they are feeding their flocks. And the man said, they have departed from here, for I heard them say, let us go to Dothan. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them in Dothan. Now when they saw him afar off, even before he came near them, they conspired against him to kill him. Brotherly love, totally absent. He's some distance away, but they recognize perhaps a tunic, right? Probably it's a unique type of tunic. And they said, look, Joseph, let's kill him. They are rogues. They are ruffians. They are thugs. They are the parents of Israel. Then they said to one another, look, this dreamer is coming, because they're still alienated, hostile because of his dreams about how they were going to bow down to Joseph. Come therefore, let us now kill him. Serious, this is the second time they mention it. Come therefore, let us now kill him, cast him into some pit, and we shall say some wild beast has devoured him. We shall see what will become of his dreams. Really hostile to these dreams. Jealous, envious, filled with hate. But Reuben heard it, and he delivered him out of their hands and said, let us not kill him. Reuben's the eldest of the family, eldest brother. And Reuben said to them, shed no blood, but cast him into this pit which is in the wilderness, and do not lay a hand on him, that he might deliver him out of their hands and bring him back to his father. So I think Reuben didn't want young Joseph to be slain. That's a good point. But he obviously didn't feel able to stand up to the other brothers, even though he was the eldest brother, the one with the authority. I guess he reckoned that this other bunch, Simeon and Judah, are a really rough lot. They might even pick on me. So what I'll do is we'll get him into the pit, and then later, when things are settled down, I'll come back and rescue him and bring him back home. So it came to pass, when Joseph had come to his brothers, that they stripped Joseph of his tunic, the tunic of many colours that was on him. Then they took him and cast him into a pit, and the pit, thankfully, was empty. There was no water in it. And they sat down to eat a meal. And later on we find out that Joseph was crying and shouting to be rescued and delivered, but they ignored him. They're busy eating their McDonald's cheeseburgers. Then they lifted their eyes and looked, and there was a company of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead with their camels bearing spices, balm and myrrh, on their way to carry them down to Egypt. So Judah said to his brothers, what profit is there if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? which is interesting in terms of stereotypes, because this is the first words out of the first Jew's mouth, Judah being a Jew, the father of the Jews, and the first words are, "What profit is there?" Right? Which of course what people think of Jews. They're always after money, usury and so on. So Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is there if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites. Let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother and our flesh." As if that made any difference. And his brothers listened. Then Midianite traders passed by, so the brothers pulled Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit. And he probably thought he was being delivered after this prank that they'd played on him, but sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. And they took Joseph to Egypt. So he's been sold into slavery. He's only 17 years old, right? And obviously his thought he was being rescued there, atom bombed. Then Reuben later returned to the pit, and indeed Joseph was not in the pit, and he tore his clothes, I guess in anxiety, in horror. And he returned to his brothers and said, "The lad is no more, and I, where shall I go?" So they took Joseph's tunic, killed a kid of the goats, dipped the tunic in the blood. Then they sent the tunic of many colours, and they brought it to their father and said, "We have found this. Do you know whether it is your son's tunic or not?" I mean, so pretty thuggish, right? Bunch of ruffians and bandits sold their young brother into slavery, and now they've got the tunic covered in blood, taken it to their ancient dad, and they know it's going to destroy him, right? This is his favourite son, after all. They're going to say, "Look, his tunic's all covered in blood. Do you think he'd be eaten by a wild animal?" That's pretty cruel to treat your father that way. And he recognized it and said, "It's my son's tunic. A wild beast has devoured him. Without doubt, Joseph is torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his clothes, put sackcloth on his waist, and mourned for his son many days. And all his sons and all his daughters arose to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted and said, "For I shall go down into the grave to my son in mourning." Thus his father wept for him. Now the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and captain of the guard, which is, basically the head of security in Egypt. So poor old Joseph, he's had dreams that suggested he'd be a person of high status and great importance. He had a privileged life, being the favoured son of his father, special tunic. Now he's sold into slavery in Egypt, Gentile nation some distance away. How's he going to react? That's pretty disappointing. That's upsetting. You're a slave rather than being the favoured son in a sort of decent home. And that's a challenge. We all face challenges, right? So how's he going to react? Get bitter and twisted, or patiently endure? How do you and I react when we hit difficult periods? Because we will hit them. Again, if you hold your place there, turn to Psalms 34. So Psalms chapter 34. Let's read verses 15 to 19. "The eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are open to their cry. The face of the Lord is against those who are evil, to cut off the remembrance of them from the earth. The righteous cry out, and the Lord hears and delivers them out of all their troubles," which of course they must have been in. You can't be delivered out of unless you're in these troubles. "The Lord is near to those who have a broken heart, and save such as have a contrite spirit. Many are the afflictions of the righteous." Oh dear. "But the Lord delivers him out of them all." So it doesn't say few are the afflictions of the righteous, or hardly ever is a righteous person afflicted. Many are the afflictions of the righteous. In the New Testament, we read, it's through much tribulation that we enter the kingdom of God. So tribulation, afflictions, they go with the territory. Especially if you're a believer, you'll often be attacked because of your beliefs and so on. Many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the good news is the Lord delivers him out of them all if we remain, faithful and loyal to God. So back to Genesis chapter 39. Pick up the continuation of the story. Let's read verses 1 through 6. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, so quite high status, captain of the guard, headman of the security of Egypt, an Egyptian, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there. Verse 2, the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a successful man. And he was in the house of his master the Egyptian, and his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all he did to prosper in his hand. So Joseph found favor in his sight, and served him. Then he made him overseer of his house, superintendent of his house, and all that he had he put under Joseph's authority. So it was from the time that he made him overseer of his house and all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in the house and in the field. Thus he, Potiphar, left all that he had in Joseph's hand, and he did not know what he had except for the bread which he ate. So Joseph was being blessed. Potiphar's house was being blessed. So you can assume that Joseph was still in a good attitude, not bitter and twisted, because God's giving him favor with Potiphar. God's blessing Joseph. He's successful. He's blessing the household over which Joseph is superintendent. So I think that implies that Joseph's still a good guy, still loyal, still faithful, still trusting God. Now Joseph, it says, was handsome in form and appearance, which is about to get him into trouble. Of course, it says earlier, back in Genesis 29, that Rachel, that's Joseph's mother, was a beautiful woman. So she's a beautiful young girl. Joseph, I guess, takes after her in many ways. So he's very handsome, good looking. And it came to pass, let's read verses 7 onwards. I think at this stage, probably Joseph is perhaps in his very late teens. Maybe by now he's into his early sort of 20s. It came to pass after these things that his master's wife cast longing eyes on Joseph, and she said, lie with me. But he refused and said to his master's wife, look, my master does not know what is with me in the house. He has committed all that he has to my hand. I'm fully trusted with everything, all the finances of the household, the buying, the selling, all of that. There is no one greater in this house than I, nor has he kept back anything from me but you, because you're his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? And of course, that demonstrates that sin wasn't something that started at the Ten Commandments at Mount Sinai. Some people seem to think the Ten Commandments, Mount Sinai, Moses, the Exodus was the beginning of sin and laws. No. Even centuries earlier, Joseph knew that adultery would be sin. So it was, as she spoke to Joseph day by day, that he did not heed her, to lie with her or to be with her. But it happened about this time, when Joseph went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house was inside, that she caught him by his garment, saying, lie with me. But he left his garment in her hand, and he fled and ran outside. It's the right thing to do. So he's doing what's right. He's resisting the temptation. He gets out of the house in a hurry, because he's trying to protect, his reputation and her reputation for that matter. And so it was when she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and fled outside, that she called to the men of her house and spoke to them, saying, see, he, my husband, has brought in to us a Hebrew to mock us. He came in to me to lie with me. And I cried out with a loud voice. And it happened when he heard that I lifted my voice and cried out, he left his garment with me and fled and went outside. So false accusations against poor Joseph, because hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. And here is a woman scorned and trying to exact revenge on this young man that wouldn't lie with her. So she kept his garment with her until his master came home. Then she spoke to him with the words like these, saying, the Hebrew servant whom you brought to us came in to me to mock me, to humiliate me, to play with me, some translations say. So it happened, as I lifted my voice and cried out, he left his garment with me and fled outside. Right? But this isn't very good, is it? She's lying. She's making false accusations about a young man who's trying to do what is right. So it was when his master heard the words which his wife spoke to him, saying, your servant did to me after this manner, that his anger was aroused. Then Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were confined. I think when it says king's prisoners, it means sort of political prisoners. I don't think this is the public prison where you get murderers and rapists and thieves. These are the king's prisoners. And this particular prison appears to be in Potiphar's house, I think in the dungeons thereof. And he was there in the prison. So again, not particularly good. So you can see how Joseph could be, again, troubled, because he's trying to do good. He's been blessed in the household of Potiphar, but now Potiphar's wife is lying about him. She's trying to seduce him. He's resisted that, the right thing to do. Now she's falsely accusing him, and now he's ending up in prison. That's not a good outcome, is it? If you're trying to do what's right and proper. If you look at Ephesians chapter 6, let's read verses 5 and 8. Ephesians chapter 6. Verses 5 and 8. Bondservants, which in essence Joseph was at this stage, been sold as a bondservant, as a slave to Potiphar, looking after Potiphar's household. Bondservants, be obedient to those who are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, in sincerity of heart, as to Christ, not with eye service as men pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, with good will, doing service as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that whatever good anyone does, he will receive the same from the Lord, whether he is slave or free. So that's how Joseph has been behaving. He's working hard, he's being honest, he's conscientious, he's resisting temptation from this woman who's trying to seduce him. He's doing everything right, as the scripture there commands bondservants to do. And he was doing that already, just naturally, because he's a good guy. If you go back to Genesis 39. I mean, you can compare the attitude of Joseph there. He's a young woman, let's assume she's fairly attractive. She's grabbing hold of Joseph and saying, come lie with me. She's trying to seduce him and he resists. Nope, not going to happen. And he runs away at one point. Compare that to, say, King David and Bathsheba. King David didn't run away, did he? Even though he was a great man of God and a king over all of Israel, he gives in and has an affair with Bathsheba with terrible outcome. And of course he gets Uriah essentially put in danger where he's almost inevitably going to be killed, and he was. So you can see here that he's trying to do what's right, but he ends up in trouble again. How come he's in prison, falsely accused, when he's trying to do what's right and live God's way and not sin with Potiphar's wife? And I think, a number of people among the church over the years have lost jobs, lost promotion, lost family, lost friends as they've tried to do what is right. It might be something like, say, keeping the Sabbath or keeping the holy days, and they've lost out. They're trying to do what's right in God's eyes, but they get blamed. They get falsely accused. They lose out in some ways. Now, of course, when that happens, you can get a bit bitter and twisted that, how come I'm trying to do what's right and I'm ending up in a worse position than others that I know who are just doing what's bad, and they're getting on, they're getting promoted, they're getting better jobs, but me trying to do what's right, I'm losing out. This can't be right, this can't be fair. Well, let's have a look at 1 Peter chapter 2, which covers this point. 1 Peter in chapter 2. It does trouble people who expect absolutely plain sailing as a believer or as a Christian, especially if you're doing what's right. You think, well, obviously I'm doing the right thing, I'm going to be blessed everywhere I go, going in and coming out. Well, 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 18 to 23. Verse 18, servants, which Joseph, of course, was at this stage, and you and I are as well. Servants, be submissive to your masters with all fear, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the harsh. For this is commendable if, because of conscience toward God, one endures grief, suffering wrongfully. Well, that's Joseph, because of his conscience toward God, towards God's laws, is enduring grief. He's suffering wrongfully because he's actually in the right. Verse 20, for what credit is it if, when you are beaten for your faults, you take it patiently? I mean, if you've been beaten for your faults, you sort of deserve it. But when you do good and suffer, if you take it patiently, this is commendable before God. There's no question that Joseph was patient. For to this you were called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that you should follow his steps, who committed no sin, no deceit found in his mouth, who, when he was reviled, did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but committed himself to him who judges righteously. So Jesus is a good example. Jesus suffered. Jesus did what was good. Joseph did what was good and ended up in jail. Jesus did what was good, helped people, healed people, taught people, right? And Jesus ended up being arrested and falsely accused like Joseph was, and Jesus ended up being scourged and whipped and nailed to a tree, right? So that's an example of somebody doing good and suffering, and we're called to that. Jesus is our example. So sometimes you and I will try and get on with people as best we can, but there will be times when we will be, falsely accused, badly treated, for no good reason, right? We just have to be patient and endure it. So let's get back to Genesis 39. Let's pick up verses 21 to 23. But the Lord, so he's in prison now, but the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy, and he gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever they did there, it was his doing. The keeper of the prison did not look into anything that was under Joseph's authority, because the Lord was with him. And whatever he did, the Lord made it prosper. So God's still with Joseph, in prison, out of prison, on the way down to Egypt, and all the rest of it, right? And he's making life easier, in a sense, for Joseph. He's still a successful man. And that sort of implies, in a sense, that Joseph was still a good man. He had a good testimony. He was clean speaking, clean living, because even the keeper of the prison recognizes, there's something about this guy. He's a really good guy. He's an honest guy. He's a conscientious guy. He's a worker. I can trust this young man who might be 21, 22, 23, 24, whatever. I can trust him with the running of the prison, right? So the keeper of the prison is responsible to Potiphar, right, and so on. He has to make sure things are done properly, but he feels confident. I can let young Joseph get on with that. That's a good testimony that Joseph has, and ideally you and I should have a good testimony with people on the outside. Let's pick up in chapter 40. Let's read verses 1 through 8. It came to pass after these things that the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their lord, the king of Egypt, and Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief butler and the chief baker. So he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the prison, the place where Joseph was confined. Well, the captain of the guard is Potiphar. This appears to be a home prison on Potiphar's property, and it's in a dungeon part we see later. And the captain of the guard, that's Potiphar, charged Joseph with them, and he served them. So they were in custody for a while. I suspect Potiphar knew there was something not quite right with his wife's story, because Joseph was such a good guy, and Potiphar's not going to be a mug, but probably doesn't really want to tackle his wife face to face. So poor old Joseph gets shunted into the dungeon, and the wife carries on doing her embroidery and whatever else he's doing. Then the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, had a dream, both of them, each man's dream in one night, each man's dream with his own interpretation. And Joseph came in to them in the morning and looked at them and saw that they were sad. So he asked Pharaoh's officers who were with him in the custody of his lord's house, Potiphar's house, saying, "Why do you look so sad today?" Well, prisoners, of course they're sad. But that sort of implies that normally, even though they're in prison, they're okay. Because Joseph has probably created quite a positive atmosphere. But today, despite Joseph's best attempts to make life as comfortable as possible in this prison, and I'm sure that's what he was trying to do, he recognizes, well, these guys look really upset. What's the matter? They said to him, "We each have had a dream, and there is no interpreter of it." Right? So they tell their dreams. The butler tells his dream, and Joseph interprets the dreams with God's help, obviously, and says to the butler, "Oh, in a few days you're going to be restored back to the Pharaoh. Right? You're going to get your job back, your status back. Tell you what, when you do that, help me out of here, because I'm here under false pretenses. So please, when you're released, speak to the Pharaoh, speak well of me, and help me to get delivered from my incarceration here." Let's pick up in verses 14 and 15. "But remember me when it is well with you, and please show kindness to me. Make mention of me to Pharaoh, and get me out of this house. For indeed I was stolen away from the land of the Hebrews, and also I've done nothing here, that they should put me into the dungeon in Potiphar's house." The baker tells his dream. Joseph points out, "You're going to be hanged till you're dead." It's not such a good dream. But the butler does get released, as Joseph had explained. But dropping down to verse 23, not verse 21, let's read verses 21 to 23. "Then he, the Pharaoh, restored the chief butler to his butlership again, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand, as Joseph had said would happen. But he hanged the chief baker, as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet the chief butler did not remember Joseph, but forgot him." That's pretty bad, really. It's only 3 days since the dream was interpreted, and you must be hanging on to. I wonder if that dream's correct or not. Then it turns up, you're called upstairs and new clothes, and you're back at your position. So here's Joseph, innocent, reliable, doing good, highly favoured, explains his dreams, yet he's overlooked again. Just unfair. Just unfair. 2 more years pass, right? And I think we can know that Joseph's character is such that he's going to continue to be positive and continue to be patient. He's disappointed, no doubt, but maybe he looks back at these dreams he had about high status and his brothers, his father bowing down to him. So let's read chapter 41. Sometimes it's darkest before the dawn, of course. Verses 1 through 7. "Then it came to pass at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh had a dream." A lot of dreams knocking about in this story. "And behold, he stood by the river. Suddenly there came up out of the river 7 cows, fine looking and fat, and they fed in the meadow. Then behold, 7 other cows came up after them out of the river, ugly and gaunt, and stood by the other cows on the bank of the river. And the ugly and gaunt cows ate up the 7 fine looking and fat cows. So Pharaoh awoke." It's a bit of a nightmare, this is. "He slept and dreamed a second time, and suddenly 7 heads of grain came up on one stalk, plump and good. Then behold, 7 thin heads, blighted by the east wind, sprang up after them. And the 7 thin heads devoured the 7 plump and full heads. So Pharaoh awoke, and indeed it was a dream." Not a very pleasant dream. So Pharaoh realizes these dreams, I think, are significant, not just the ordinary dream after too much pizza the night before. These are real dreams that have been given for a purpose. So he calls for all the experts, the astrologers, the magicians to explain. None of them can, right? At that point, our butler belatedly remember, "Oh, hang on a second, I do remember when I was in the prison, a man there interpreted my dream. Maybe you should call him Mr. Pharaoh, and he might help you out." Let's read verses 14 to 16. "Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they brought him quickly out of the dungeon. And he shaved, changed his clothing, and came to Pharaoh. He's probably long beard, long hair, smelling a bit. You can't go before the Pharaoh looking like that, so you had a quick shower, shave, nice, clean, fresh clothes on, bit of cologne, and off he goes to the Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I've had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. But I've heard it said of you that you can understand a dream to interpret it. Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, It's not in me. God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace. So let's drop down to verses 25 to 46. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, The dreams of Pharaoh are one. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years. The 7 good heads are 7 years. The dreams are actually the same. They're one. The 7 thin and ugly cows, which came up after them, are 7 years. The 7 empty heads, blighted by the east wind, are 7 years of famine. This is the thing which I have spoken to Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. Indeed, 7 years of great plenty will come throughout all the land of Egypt. But after them, 7 years of famine will arise, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt. The famine will deplete the land, so the plenty will not be known in the land because of the famine following, for it will be very severe. And the dream was repeated to Pharaoh twice, because the thing is established by God, and God will shortly bring it to pass. So there's the dreams. That's what they mean. And then Joseph carries on now with his own advice. Now therefore let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh do this, and let him appoint officers over the land to collect 1/5 of all the produce of the land of Egypt in the 7 plentiful years, 20%. Let them gather all the food of those good years that are coming, store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh. Let them keep food in the cities, so create warehouses, gather the food, store it up in the good years, years of plenty, so that when they're over and the famine arises, you get all the stuff you can dip into. Then that food shall be a reserve for the land for the 7 years of famine which shall be in the land of Egypt, that the land may not perish, or the people perish, during the famine. So the advice was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of all his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, Can we find such a one as this, a man in whom is the Spirit of God? They recognize as something special about Joseph. He's interpreted the dream, and he's also just given us the solution, the way forward. We didn't even ask him for that. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, Inasmuch as God has shown you all this, there is clearly no one as discerning and wise as you. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall be ruled according to your word. Only in regard to the throne will I be greater than you. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, See, I've set you over all the land of Egypt. You've been over Potiphar's house. You've been over the prison. Now he's over the entire land of Egypt, the millions of Egyptians, the wealth, the prosperity, the fame. And Joseph's the top man, just underneath the Pharaoh. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring off his hand, put it on Joseph's hand, and he clothed him in garments of fine linen, put a gold chain around his neck. He had him ride in the 2nd chariot which he had, and they cried out before him, Bow the knee! So he set him over all the land of Egypt. Pharaoh also said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh. Without your consent, no man may lift his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. You are top dog. You're in control of everything in this country. And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphnath-Paaneah, and he gave him as wife Asenath, the daughter of Potipharah, priest of On. So Joseph went out over all the land of Egypt. Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went throughout all the land of Egypt. And the story of the famine and the plenty sort of follows that. So here's Joseph. He's gone from the prison to the palace in one day. From being smelly in the prison, and he's now got great garments, signet ring of the Pharaoh, linen clothes, sort of gold necklace around his neck. He's now in charge of everything in Egypt. And that happened just in a few hours, in one day. And he's Prime Minister of Egypt, effectively. He's married off to nobility, right? He has a couple of kids, Ephraim and Manasseh, we'll read about a bit later. And he's now ruling, governing the world's greatest empire of the day, right? He will save millions from starvation by his wisdom how he conducts things in the next few years, right? He's now just age 30. He was 17 when he came into Egypt. I think we read that earlier. So 13 years of trouble, right? But now he's gone from being a slave to being essentially the most important man over the biggest empire of the world in that day. That's pretty fast moving, right? So let's carry on the story. Famine, the years of plenty come and go. The famine kicks off. Let's read it, chapter 42. Let's read verses 1 to 4. Going back to Canaan. When Jacob saw that there was grain in Egypt, Jacob said to his sons, "Why do you look at one another? Why are you staring at each other, doing nothing?" And he said, "Indeed, I've heard there is grain in Egypt." None here in Canaan. "Go down to that place and buy for us there, that we may live and not die." So Joseph's 10 brothers went down to buy grain in Egypt. But Jacob did not send Joseph's brother Benjamin with his brothers, for he said, lest some calamity befall him. Benjamin's the youngest brother. So off they go, down to Egypt to buy this grain. Joseph spots them. Of course, he knows who they are. He accuses them of being spies. "You've gone to the land to spy out Egypt and to take advantage of us, haven't you?" And they say, "Oh, nothing of the sort. We've got an old father back in Canaan, and we've got a brother who's not here, Benjamin, our younger brother." So Joseph says, to prove that you're not spies, go back to the land, bring this brother of yours, Benjamin, down. Benjamin is actually Joseph's brother, same mother, Rachel. So it's Joseph's absolute blood brother. These others are brothers through Leah and Bilhah and Zilpah. But Benjamin's his actual brother. He'd like to see him. So he holds on to Simeon. He arrests Simeon, one of the brothers, and says, "Go home and bring back your brother. If you bring back your brother, this young man, Benjamin, will know that you're being truthful. Otherwise, you're spies and you'll all get killed if you come back again without your brother." So, they go back to Jacob. Jacob's upset because he's now got another son missing. Simeon's, Joseph's missing, killed by a wild animal years earlier, and now Simeon's missing. And they want to take Benjamin? Wow, what if he doesn't come back? You'll bring me down to the grave at this rate. But of course, eventually the food runs out that they've brought back, and they're convinced they have to go back to Egypt, so they go back to Egypt, and so on. And Joseph welcomes them, organizes a great big feast for them, and they all are fed well. Surprisingly, they're all seated at this big table in exact age order, which they're surprised at. Oh, we're on the correct order. What a sort of coincidence that was. And then he sends them back with food, but Joseph plays a bit of a sneaky trick on them. He puts his special cup in Benjamin's sack of food, sends them back to Canaan, then sends his militia after them and say, "You've stolen something from our Lord Joseph." So they say, "No, we haven't." We'll have a check it out. They check it out, and lo and behold, Benjamin's bag contains the special cup. And now they're in real trouble, right? Because now they could be killed by Joseph, and so on, right? And then Joseph says, "Well, tell you what, because it was in Benjamin's bag, his sack of grain, I'll keep Benjamin as a slave. You lot can go back to Canaan to your father, but I'm going to hold on to Benjamin here." And I think, well, can't do that. I mean, our father will collapse in a heap. So let's pick up the story in chapter 44. Let's read verses 15 to 34. Joseph said to them, "What deed is this you have done, stealing my cup? Did you not know that such a man as I can certainly practice divination?" Then Judah said, "What shall we say to my lord? What shall we speak? How can we clear ourselves? God has found out the iniquity of your servants. Here we are, my lord's slaves, both we and he also, with whom the cup was found." But Joseph said, "Far be it from me that I should do so. The man in whose hand the cup was found, he shall be my slave," which is Benjamin. "As for you, go up in peace to your father." All right, sounds decent trade-off. Then Judah came near to him and said, "O my lord, please let your servant speak a word in my lord's hearing. Do not let your anger burn against your servant, for you are even like Pharaoh in importance and status. My lord asked his servants previously, saying, Have you a father or a brother? And we said to my lord, We have a father, an old man, and a child of his old age who is young. His brother is dead, and he alone is left of his mother's children, and his father loves him. Then you said to your servants, Bring him down to me, that I may set my eyes on him. And we said to my lord, The lad cannot leave his father, for if he should leave his father would die. But you said to your servants, Unless your youngest brother comes down with you, you shall see my face no more. So it was, when we went up to your servant my father, that we told him the words of my lord. And our father said, Go back and buy us a little food. But we said, We cannot go down. If our youngest brother is with us, then we will go down. For we may not see the man's face unless our youngest brother is with us. Then your servant, my father, said to us, You know that my wife bore me 2 sons, that's Rachel, and the one went out from me, and I said, Surely he is torn to pieces, and I have not seen him since. But if you take this one also from me, and calamity befalls him, you shall bring down my grey hair with sorrow to the grave. Now therefore, says Judah, when I come to your servant my father, and the lad is not with us, since his life is bound up in the lad's life, it will happen when he sees that the lad is not with us, he will die. So your servants will bring down the grey hair of your servant our father with sorrow to the grave. For your servant became surety for the lad to my father, saying, If I do not bring him back to you, then I shall bear the blame before my father forever. Now therefore, please, let your servant, Judah, remain instead of the lad as a slave to my lord, and let the lad go up with his brothers. For how shall I go up to my father if the lad is not with me, lest perhaps I see evil would come upon my father? So it's possible that Joseph might be running a sort of test here. They abandoned him when he was a teenager. Might they abandon Benjamin as well to protect their own necks and just leave him there and go back to the father? Would they care for the father? Didn't care too much previous time when they brought back the bloody tunic. Do you think this is Joseph's tunic? Of course, I knew it was. I mean, they'd done it all. Didn't care about Jacob's reaction. So it could be a test here. Are they more mature than that? Thankfully, they do sort of pass the test. Judah's prepared to sacrifice himself. Voluntarily become a slave to Joseph, or whatever the name they've got him as long as Benjamin can go back and not destroy Jacob's life. Let's read in 45, verses 1 through 15. Then Joseph could not restrain himself before all those who stood by him, and he cried out, Make everyone go out from me. He's just getting too emotional by all this stuff. So no one stood with him while Joseph made himself known to his brothers, and he wept aloud. And the Egyptians and the house of Pharaoh heard it. Then Joseph said to his brothers, I'm Joseph. Does my father still live? But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed in his presence. Well, first of all, shock. He was the prime minister of Egypt that they don't recognize, I guess, 17 to 32, I think, this age here. So Joseph's taller, heavier, more muscular, his face a bit more lined perhaps, plus the garments he's wearing. They don't recognize him, although he recognizes all of them, of course. And plus they're probably thinking, the last time we saw him, we were selling him into slavery. I think our goose is cooked. So they're a bit dismayed, put it mildly. And Joseph said to his brothers, Please come near to me. So they came near. Then he said, I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt. Because he's now speaking Hebrew, I guess. I suspect before that he was using a pretend translator to translate allegedly from Egyptian to Hebrew for the brothers. But now, of course, he can use his own language, which is fluent in. And I'm your brother, I'm Joseph, I'm little Joe. Little Joe that you sold into slavery, you scumbags, right? But now do not therefore be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. For these 2 years the famine has been in the land. There are still 5 years to come in which there will be neither ploughing nor harvesting. It's got a long way to go. And God sent me before you to preserve a posterity for you in the earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So now it was not you who sent me here, but it was, but God was sort of behind it. And he has made me a father to Pharaoh and the lord of all his house, and a ruler throughout all the land of Egypt. Hurry, go up to my father. Say to him, Thus says your son Joseph, God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, do not tarry. You shall dwell in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near to me, you and your children, your children's children, your flocks and your herds, and all that you have. There I'll provide for you, lest you and your household and all that you have come to poverty, for there's still 5 years of famine, which obviously he knew. Behold, your eyes and the eyes of my brother Benjamin see that it is my mouth that speaks to you. So you shall tell my father of all my glory in Egypt, and of all that you have seen, and you shall hurry and bring my father down here. Then he fell on his brother Benjamin's neck and wept, and Benjamin wept on his neck. That's his older brother, Joseph, that he heard about, his brother of the same mother. Moreover, he kissed all his brothers and wept over them, and after that his brothers talked with him. So he doesn't chop the heads off, right? And so after a rather rocky start to his life, Joseph ends up prospering, powerful, immense status. He's being used by God to save the world in that day from the famine, not just Egypt, but the surrounding nations as well, such as Canaan. He's got great prosperity, great status, right? Can do anything he wants. He controls all of Egypt, the greatest empire of the world at that time. We read elsewhere that Joseph lives on to be 110, right? So pretty good run after a rocky start. And his God-given dreams come true. His dreams were that his brothers would bow before him, and they did. His father, mother, and brothers bowed before him, and they did. And God's watched over him and used him very powerfully for the benefit of the people of Israel and the benefit even of the world in a larger sense. And it's good to see examples like Joseph in Scripture, because here's the guy who went through really troublesome times, sold into slavery, does good, put into prison, does good, left in prison. But then, when the time was right, he's delivered from prison and becomes prime minister a few hours later, with all the power and authority you could possibly have over Egypt. And he uses his wisdom to gather all the crops, which will feed the world for the 7 years of famine. So Joseph, a super example of faithfulness and loyalty, even through very difficult times, which is what you and I sometimes face, very difficult times. Do we hang in there? Will we be loyal in sickness and in health, for richer or for poorer, right? Is that what we're like? Do we have that sort of covenant with God? Let's close in 2 Chronicles chapter 16. Turn to 2 Chronicles in chapter 16. Just read some of the words of the prophet or the seer Hanani. Verse 9, the prophet says, For the eyes of the Lord run to and fro throughout the whole earth to show himself strong on behalf of those whose heart is loyal to him. Right? That's what it says God's looking for. God's eyes looking here, looking there, searching here, searching there, looking for those who are loyal to him so that he can show himself strong to them, work in their behalf. For the eyes of the Lord run to and fro throughout the whole earth to show himself strong on behalf of those whose heart is loyal to him. So, there are men in the Bible who made mistakes. You've made mistakes, I've made mistakes, but if we're loyal to God, faithful to him, he can do a lot for us and with us. We might stumble too often. I guess we probably imagine that we do. We might not all possess all the technical knowledge of doctrine and so on that we could do, but we can all endeavour, all of us, to do what Joseph did and to remain faithful and loyal and positive to God, irrespective of the circumstances around us, which might at times be rather darker than we would like. Faithful and loyal is what God's looking for. His eyes are looking for people like that. Hopefully, when he looks, he'll find that you and I are in that category, faithful and loyal servants of the Creator God of the universe. Okay, with that we'll conclude today's message.